Let's start recording. There. So again, no, why the question of why are we talking about diaspora for what is supposed to be a Philippine lit class, right? And I guess it's because there's this acknowledgement of the volume of people, right, that we have overseas. Number one, and number two, profound the profound effect that movement of people has had on the Filipino life and Filipino experience. And it's not just for those who are leaving, it's also for those who are here. Is one. The other one is the OFWs do have a very profound effect, not just on the families of those who were separated, but in fact it has an effect on the national economy. If you didn't know, right? OFW remittances is one of the things that keeps this country afloat, right? During the tough crises in the past few years, it has always been OFW remittances that kind of save the day for the Philippine economy. And so it is therefore, in my mind at least, when I was thinking about it, a worthy topic of discussion and therefore worth looking at, no, because it is such a profound thing and relatively unique, right? There's not a lot of, well, there are quite a few diasporic peoples around, but our version of it is a little different, right? As it is always, it's a little different because um, it's voluntary for one thing, right? The displacement that happens is not forced; it's voluntary. So anyway, we'll get to that in a bit, no? And we'll talk about that. And please feel free to interrupt. Please feel free to raise your hand or talk or express an opinion. I welcome it. Right. I do not like talking on the screen for uh, an hour and a half, really, because I feel weird. It doesn't feel right to me. So anyway, and then there are still people showing up. So excuse me if I sometimes pause. Okay, so diaspora, right? Diaspora comes from the Greek ba Latin, right? Meaning scattered seeds. And the original concept of it, I'm sure you know, right? Was from the Jews, right? Are you familiar with that? I guess you are. Yeah. You're familiar with the term, right? I mean, but do you know how far back it is? The Jewish diaspora? Anybody want to guess? No, nobody's guessing.
Through the Bible? It's the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. It actually goes all the way back to the Bible. Jesus Christ, diba? Um, but yeah, the idea of was diaspora goes back to this, right? The idea of a traumatic historical event from Jewish experience. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But diaspora is also um, something that would cover originally, yeah, when people started doing diasporic studies. The idea also covered certain groups, the Armenians, particularly the Armenians, the Africans, and the Irish, right? Later on, also the Palestinians. And although the Palestinians is a little bit of a controversial discussion, but uh, all of these peoples suffered a traumatic displacement from their homes or from the locations which they decided to be their homes, right? So let's start with the Jews. The Jews actually, well, we'll talk about it by the next slide. I think it's here. Oh, no, it's not there. Okay, so it's here. The Jews actually come from the Bible. It was all the way back to the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, right? That's how far back the diaspora is. Related to that kasi is the rebellion by the Jewish leader named, if I remember right, no, Zadikiel, right, against the Babylonian emperor. The rebellion failed, and as a result, the Jews lost their traditional home, and they became scattered, right? And the term now was scattered forever. So there was this thinking that the Jews would never find their home again, right? And that's why you have a wide distribution of uh, people of Jewish faith all over the world. It's because they really had no home, so they were just finding their home wherever they could and finding their practice wherever they could. So that's one. The Armenians would be the result of ethnic cleansing in World War One by the Turks, right? Turkey. And they were also displaced from their land, and they were either driven out or killed by the Turk. It was ethnic cleansing in this case. The Africans, I think, is more familiar to you guys, right? When you talk about the slave trade, right? The African American experience, the African experience, why there are uh, people of African descent all over the world, it was via the slave trade. Again, they were taken from their homes and then placed in a work in a placed in servitude in lands which were completely unfamiliar to them, right? The Irish would be because of the Great Famine that happened, I think, in the late 19th century or early 20th century, right? The Great Famine in Ireland forced people to leave the country because they really had nothing to eat, and they struck out to find other places to make their fortune. And then the Palestinians would be the most recent one, in that these guys were displaced in 1948, so after World War II, and they were displaced by the Jews, right? Who took a section of Palestine, and that section of Palestine is now called Israel. So if you're wondering what's one of the roots of the current uh, Israeli Palestinian conflict, it's that, right? That the Palestinians have always said that they were forcibly ejected from their lands, which is now called Israel, right? And in the process, the state of Israel was formed. So that's kind of one of the reasons, one of many reasons. There are many reasons why uh, they are fighting, but there. So that's the original idea of diaspora. So it had to come from an historic, traumatic event, right? And forceful displacement of people, scattering them, and therefore these people had no place to return to, right? That changed though later on, right? There, as I said, no, that changed later on. There, the dates are here. So the Armenians was 1915, the Irish was 1845 to 1852. The speculation is that the Irish famine could have been actually mitigated by the British, but the British decided not to do anything. And in so doing, let the famine force these people out, allowing the British to get more control over Irish territory. And then, of course, the Palestinians in 1948, right? Uh, so, some common traits, like I said, there. Forced displacement, the idea of it being a traumatic historical event, right? Of them having a traumatic historical event, and the importance, therefore, of a concept of homeland, because they don't have one, right? They don't have a physical geographic location to go to. And so the idea of home becomes very important. That means that they had to somehow preserve their culture, their heritage, wherever they were, right? Hence the creation of well, not very politically correct. No? In the case of the Jews, what were called Jew towns um, before. The more familiar one to you guys is, of course, Chinatown, right? Chinatown is a form of preservation of heritage. And yes, that becomes part of the idea of diaspora later on, right? But if you notice, just stopping here no for a bit, um, the Philippine experience is not this, right? We were never, well, at least not traumatically forced from our lands. We still have the Philippines as a place to return to. And therefore, the idea of homeland is not just an idea. It's not just this memory that we have of a home. It's something that's real, right? The people who go out and become OFWs do have a place, uh, to return to, right? So they decided, therefore, diasporic scientists or diasporic researchers decided to expand the idea of it, right? Because the experience of separation is not necessarily traumatic, right? But there is always the idea of retaining a memory of the homeland and continuing to find ways of relating to said homeland, right? And that's kind of where I will slow down and stop first, because that's where we are, right? The idea of this because happened because there were movements of people that weren't traumatic, but were clearly a scattering of different people to different locations anyway. And the one some examples are the Chinese and Japanese labor movements before, during the late 19th, early 20th century, when Japanese and Chinese laborers were being used to build railroad tracks or infrastructure, and they weren't really, they weren't really prevented from returning to where they came from. The problem was they just couldn't afford to go back to where they came from. Remember that travel was much more expensive and much more prohibitive then than it is now. So, uh, and a good example of that, right, is the experience of the Filipino Chinese here in the country, where Chinese laborers were imported from, well, China, because they were the only ones who knew how to work granite, right? Because the stones of Intramuros, particularly the stones used in Intramuros is granite. Granite is not native to the Philippines. We do not have granite. And so what happens is, we import the granite from China. But because Filipinos have no knowledge of how to cut and process granite, we needed the technology for it, which was, of course, uh, brought in with the laborers, the Chinese laborers. The Chinese laborers also put up shops which allowed them to import the tools and equipment they needed to cut the granite, right? These guys were, of course, located where? Anybody want to guess? Binondo, right? These guys were located in Binondo. Why? Because it's close to Intramuros. Number one. Number two, they were not allowed to live in Intramuros because they were not Spanish, right? And so they lived outside of Intramuros, but they needed to be close enough to Intramuros that it wasn't difficult to travel to go to work. Remember, they had no cars. They probably didn't have any calesas or carts either. They would probably walk to work. So the best place to be would be walking distance to wherever you work. That's one. The other one was the equipment being imported by Chinese traders as well, which meant that you needed the place where you could move whatever you imported, very easily to wherever you were working. Which is why in Binondo, you have a lot. How many people here are from Binondo, by the way? Just to check. May I see a show of hands or anything? No one? Okay, no one. Okay, anyway, but you've been to Binondo, I assume, right? Okay, so but Binondo, if you notice, if you're familiar with Binondo, uh, there are a lot of hardware stores in Binondo. There are a lot, and you guys think they're small. The tendency is they look like little hardware stores. The hardware stores you see everywhere. The thing is, these hardware stores have probably been around for like over a century, right? Because they've been importing tools and equipment since the time of the Spaniards, and they're a lot bigger than you think, right? Some of this, I remember I used to work there. Some of the buildings there are actually hardware stores, right? But they're already buildings, and of course, they don't open that. They don't have the guy at the counter, waiting for you to ask for taco or something. No, instead these guys are, full on showrooms of the equipment that they bring in, and they supply corporate clients. They supply, big time construction companies and all that stuff. But that's the reason why in Binondo there is an unusual concentration of hardware stores, right, or construction equipment stores in different ways. Because nga, that was the main industry during when they first arrived. That was the main industry that they had, right? That and of course providing labor for cutting the stones. And then of course I let me just ask you a quick question. Why are they in Binondo? Why aren't they across the river, let's say just outside Intramuros? Why are they across the river? Anybody want to guess?
Sure. Right.
Yes, the Spaniards didn't want them near because they have a sense of home or community in Binondo. Yeah, but you could have done that like across the river. Like, why are they placed across the river? It was because the Spaniards didn't trust them. And so the Spaniards located them right across the river. And if you go to Intramuros, you will see cannons pointed at Binondo up to now, right? There are still cannons pointed at Binondo. Why? In case the Chinese decided to stage a rebellion, they were literally a cannon shot away, right? So they could quash any rebellion from the Chinese because they could literally just bombard their houses with cannon. So that's why Binondo is that. Binondo, as I guess you know, right? Binondo is the oldest Chinatown. It's the first Chinatown, and therefore we have one of the first instances of uh, that kind of diaspora, right? The labor diaspora, the one which is voluntary, the one where they are not barred from returning, right? But because, like I said, no, let me put this open again. Like I said, no, the the just the means to travel was very difficult. It's not impossible because there were people, especially when they became wealthy enough. Chinese traders would go back, right, to Binondo, to Binondo, to China, to share the wealth with their families, maybe recruit their cousin to come with them so that they can go back to the Philippines. Oh, by the way, for those of you who have Chinese descent and can trace your lineage back to the Spanish times, please do not think that you are pure Chinese. Most likely you are not, right? At least, how do you say? Uh, by I don't want to like sound racist, but you're not purebred Chinese because what happens usually is that the Chinese traders who lived in the Philippines would take on a non-Chinese wife or a non-Chinese spouse to make them more acceptable in society. And so what happens is usually they'll find a mestiza or someone with relatively with some sort of prestige or influence. They will marry them. Excuse me. Have kids, right? Have kids, and these kids are the ones that these kids are the ones that eventually inherit the business and all of that. However, usually these Chinese traders also had Chinese families in China, right? And so those that kind of became complicated after a while because at a certain point when if the guy is successful enough, he'll want to bring his Chinese family to the Philippines as well. And so there were a lot of Chinese traders with two families, right? Two families, one being pure Chinese, one being not. But for most of them, because of the just that practice of intermarrying to kind of become more socially acceptable, chances are if you can trace your lineage back to that, you are not pure Chinese. You're mestiza also. Which also explains why a lot of Filipino Chinese don't quite look as, you know, look the same as, Chinese from China, right? We don't quite look the same. Where our faces are not as flat normally, right? We're also a little bigger in frame, if you've noticed. We're actually stockier in frame than the Chinese because the Chinese are actually very fine, very small in frame. So those are some of the reasons why, right? May halo, yeah. So where therefore is the idea of purity, the racial purity that some people, some Chinese families kind of want to preserve. It's really not. racial, it's cultural, right? There's a cultural purity that they want to preserve, and they're afraid that if their children marry, excuse me, a non-Chinese, it will, get diluted and by Chinese culture. Um, but I think in the Philippines, it's kind of, you know, impossible. The Chinese culture is pretty much ingrained in our culture, right? And I don't think it's gonna go anywhere, really. You guys all ate tikoy in New Year, right? Diba? You guys celebrated Chinese New Year for one thing, right? So it's probably not gonna go anywhere, right? One last piece of trivia about the Filipino Chinese is that we most of the Filipino Chinese come from uh I forget the province, but one province from China, right? Comes from one province in China, and that's why our food is like that. That's why our Chinese food is like that because it's the food of that province, right? It's related to Cantonese. I don't remember the name of the Guangdong. I don't remember. Sorry, Abby, go.
Is it Guangzhou?
Guangzhou. Yeah, yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yes. Thank you. That's where we have an SM. There is an SM in Guangzhou because the C family still has ties to the original province. So in China there is an SM, right? So that's how close it is. I think a lot of those families still have investments there. Why? Because they have family there, right? And who do you trust more than family, right? So there, no. So that's kind of the interesting thing about it. So I'm talking about how the Chinese were the original OFWs coming here, right? And then at a certain point, we started to export labor. So if you look at history, the idea of exporting labor is not new. It's not even like, diba? It's not new. It's been happening for years, or even you could say centuries. No, it's just that it's a little, it's new to us, right? It's new to us in the sense that we weren't really doing it in huge numbers until around the 1970s, 1980s, because people just wanted to get out of the country, right? And given the problems happening with the Marcos regime and life being difficult, right? Trying to make money was difficult. That was what drove a lot of people to leave. And in fact, the first wave of uh, expatriates that we had weren't laborers; they were skilled people. They were doctors, lawyers, they were educated people, and they were the ones who first left because one, they had the means, and two, they had the ability to find a job elsewhere, right? It was when the Middle East started to, become successful, and there was a demand for labor in the Middle East in the 1980s, I think, when there was suddenly an opportunity for people who weren't as educated and did not have really the means to travel to get a chance to work abroad, right? Diba, for a while, when you say OFW, the automatic destination is Saudi Arabia. And the work that was being done really were things like forklift operator, truck driver, construction worker. The thing was, which we could do here. The thing was, the pay there was so much higher than the pay here. And so if you're a construction worker, why not? Right? If you could easily earn three times your pay, right? The sacrifice is you live abroad for a few years. Why not? Some people, I do have relatives who are like that. Some people have never come home. So like my aunt, right? She's an aunt. She she went in the 1970s as a domestic in Hong Kong, has never come home. Right. Her kids grew up here. Her kids are now in the States and all these places. Uh, I don't know if they've ever met, right? At least in person. And I've never seen her in person, in truth, right? She's always lived in Hong Kong. and she's never come back. I don't know if that's. I don't think that's because of a lack of means. I think it's just she doesn't want to come home, right? So there, no. So again, there is no longer the traumatic experience of being displaced. That it's now a lot of voluntary movements. Not that this doesn't happen now. If you go look at Syria, for example, if you go look at points of conflict in the world, there are still people being displaced, and these are probably going to be future diaspora as well. No, when they start creating their own towns, their own communities inside the countries where they are, then that becomes a diasporic um, people, a diasporic group, right? They'll have to think about ways of relating to their homeland. The whole idea of Philippine pride is actually related to that. Think about it. Lou Diamond Phillips is, I don't know, one-fourth Filipino. Suddenly we're proud of him, or this actress, or this actor, or this athlete, right? This guy achieved something and he happens to be of Philippine descent. That's not mean he's not Filipino. He's probably a foreigner, a foreign citizen. But because he has Philippine blood, right, there is a way of claiming it. And that's kind of why do they do that? Right? It's because that's how they relate to home. If you guys have relatives in the States, oh wait, Bea, go.
Hi, sir. Just wanted to add that concept of retaining memory of their homeland. I think
Mhm.
it's good to bring up that, for example, OFWs, they don't have their memory of the homeland is kind of static, I think. And I've witnessed this from my relatives in the States, for example.
Yeah.
I've talked to a grandfather, and like he was originally an OFW and he eventually settled there. And when he asked me about the Philippines, his memory is always like, oh, I like the adobo, and like, the traditional like things you'd remember as a Filipino living in the 1990s or 80s. But he was even surprised na may CNN news channel na pala sa Pilipinas. Like, that's how static his memory of the Philippines is. And he doesn't know it as a slightly urbanized country. So, yeah, I'd say that their memory is static. And
Yeah.
however, that's not to say that their memory is invalid. That's how they
No,
keep in touch with the homeland. So, yeah, I just think that's pretty interesting.
it is. I mean, I have relatives too who live in the States. And yeah, they're especially since some of my relatives, I have a relative, she passed away recently, but I have a relative who left in the 1960s, right? 1965. The next time she came back was what? In the 80s or in the 90s. So literally like 20 years after she comes back. And so she was confused, right? She arrives and she was confused because ang daming building, right? We had highways, we had malls, we had all these things that just weren't in existence when she was there, right? Another one was, and this one is even more recent. No? My brother-in-law emigrated to Australia, and so, but this was what 2000s now, like 2004, I think, or something like that. He emigrated to Australia, and he comes back fairly regularly. But it's interesting that I think what a couple of years ago he came back, and he stayed for a while. He stayed for a few months, and he was saying that he was shocked at the rate of change in the Philippines, right? I think it was still the Pinoy administration. It wasn't the Duterte administration yet. But he was shocked at the rate of change because at a certain point he was coming back every year, right? So he'd come, he'd leave, he'd come. And so he says, every year I see another building come up. Every year the landscape that he sees, the the physical landscape that he sees was shifting. And he says that's incredible because you don't see that normally in countries, especially since people keep talking about how poor the country is and how it's not going anywhere. And he was saying at the rate of construction that you guys are doing, it's faster than Australia, it's faster than many countries out there, right? So that's something also that a lot of these people who live abroad deal with when they come back. It's like, oh my god, this isn't the country I left, right? And when they come back again, it's like, oh my God, it's changed again. So the Philippines is it's a place that's rapidly changing, and for a lot of them, it increases their sense of displacement because when they come home, they're expecting one thing, and they like, what the hell, right? Where's the street where I used to go to, or where's the and this is something I experienced from my relatives. Where's this store where they buy, let's say, uh halo-halo from? Hahanapin nila yun. And it's like this obscure place that probably doesn't exist anymore. Right? Hahanapin nila yung kalye, hahanapin nila yung tindahan. If they're lucky, it's become a chain and you can find it in a mall. If they're not and it closed, well, it's gone. Right? And yeah, the same with my brother-in-law and his wife. um, when she comes home, she will always go to Rodix, right? She will always go to Rodix and have the sisig. Why? Because she studied in UP. And so that's one of the things she will always do. She will go to Rodix and not just we've taken her to other places with better sisig, right? But no, Rodix has to be Rodix, has to be the sisig. And she, ano yun? So it's the sisig, lechon. She will always want lechon. So we have to hunt for places where there's good lechon. And it cannot be just any lechon because it has to be the Manila lechon. It has to be the lechon where you use the sauce, the Mang Tomas sauce. It has to be that lechon. And now, di ba, you have Cebu lechon, you have Rico's, right? I'm sure you've heard of Rico's, you've heard of Zumba these places. It's Cebu lechon. It's you don't need the sauce. Pero hindi, she wants that lechon. The slightly, in my opinion, the slightly bland. The slightly bland lechon where you have to put sauce to make it taste like something. But yun nahanap niya. That and ano yun? Uh, the ube from the Good Shepherd sisters. So before they would come often. Now because of the you were like, oh, Cebu lechon. Am I making you guys hungry? I hope not. It's too early, man. Um, it's too early for lechon. So before, because they'd come home every year and it was a big event, we'd have to go to Baguio because it has to be the one from Baguio, right? We have to go to Baguio to buy. Sir Jay saying, but it's not too early for Cebu lechon. Paksiw. And you're right. But yeah, so we have to go to Baguio and buy the Good Shepherd ube to bring back down so that when they arrive, she has the ube, which she will eat here. Because if I remember right, she can't bring it to Australia. So she will eat the ube. I don't know if alam ko pwede, but anyway, right? She'll eat it here. But there, right? The idea of that memory of home. Another way which we see that is when the obsession of our foreign countrymen with media from the Philippines, right? The Filipino channel, for example, is a huge thing for people who live abroad. That's why Willie de Villame, with his show, became such a huge celebrity. It was because it wasn't just the local audiences, but it was the foreign audiences who would actually um, fuel the show's viewership. And I had like I have a friend who lives in New Jersey. He's very successful. He's a doctor, and what does he do? He wants to go watch Wawa win. And I was like, dude, why? It's like because apparently to them, Wawa win is a charity show. It's not a game show. It's a show where Willie helps the poor. It's like, di ba, I'm twisted. It's like, talaga? That's what you think? Yeah. So apparently to a lot of them, it's this charity show. I don't know if you can relate it to like one of the daytime talk shows of the United States, but yeah. So, and that's kind of where Ellen, yes, or before Oprah, right? So they kind of relate, wow, Willie Revillame to that. And I, I had to ask him, don't you think he's kind of making fun of them while he's doing this whole charitable thing? Don't you think that's wrong? That's why you see a lot of foreigners in the show. They insist on going and watching live, right? And it's their way of connecting to the Philippines, right? My wife's aunts who live in the States, right, will only watch TFC. And funnily enough, when they get here and they visit, they will still just watch ABS-CBN. The only channel they're on is ABS-CBN, which kind of sucks right now, right? Um, but yun, so they'll watch that all day. The telenovelas, they follow the telenovelas, they do that, and that's how they stay in touch. And so the places that they want to go to are the places that they watch in TFC. So I saw this restaurant in TFC. I want to go there, you know. And it's like, okay, there are better places, but no, I want to go there because it was featured on TFC. So, diba, it's not the food, it's the memory of home. It's the idea of home that they're trying to reconnect to, right? So, anyway, let's go back to this is the last slide, by the way, but we'll talk about things some more. So, because of the realization that there were other diasporas that didn't necessarily uh, follow the idea of a traumatic experience and that they could not return, what they realized was that there were other diaspora that actually allowed you to return, but they were still not, there was still the sense of diaspora. This is some of the expanded version of it that they have. No, so the idea is that there was a dispersal from a center, right? Whether voluntary or not, right? They retain a collective memory or a vision or a myth about their homeland. A lot of times, the memory of home gets romanticized, gets idealized. And so that kind of fuels this disappointment that happens when they come home, right? That, oh, it's not pala what I thought it was. They believe that they are not and probably will never be accepted where they are. That's an important point. That even if, let's say, you've been in a foreign country for years, you will always feel a little alien, right? You will always feel like you don't quite belong. And that's interesting because for Filipinos who are very adaptable, there is still that sense, right? That for some, there is still that sense that no, I'm never quite going to be, you know, here. The homeland, again, like I said, is idealized, and that someday they can return. And that's interesting because you do have people right now who live in the States, for example, and probably may have lived for decades in the States, raised their children, they have grandchildren in the States, and yet they're the ones who want to come back, right? Parang the sense is that they've done their duty, they've given their children better lives, and now they can come home, right? Merong ganon. They believe in trying to preserve and restore their homeland and its prosperity, either by helping the homeland, donations, right, participation in certain social groups, or by building community where they are. So that's why there is, especially let's say in the United States, there are Filipino towns, there are Chinatowns, there are Korea towns, right? All of these people are working to try and preserve their homeland, right? In their memories, right? This idealized homeland that they have, and then they have ways of returning, of relating to that homeland, which helps reinforce their ethno-communal consciousness, meaning at communities. They form communities, they form groups. This is something that for any of you who may be thinking about, working abroad or traveling abroad or emigrating, this is something that you'll always experience, right? Filipino community. And I do suggest that if you are going to do that, to emigrate, that you look for the Filipino community in your area. Why? They do take care of you. You do take care of each other, right? It's kind of like how the Chinatown here works, where some businessmen, some Chinese businessmen will only work with other businessmen of the same community because they trust them, right? They have they are more secure about not being swindled or anything like that. It's the same in the Philippines, in Filipino communities, where there is a sense of trust that we have just because we are all of from the same country. And I like to call it the Filipino mafia, actually. Why do I call it that? You kind of get some perks, right? Um, you kind of get some perks. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Have you ever traveled abroad, usually to a Southeast Asian country, and chances are there's going to be a Filipino person somewhere where you're shopping, working in the store, right? And if you talk to that person might be able to get you a discount, right? Or if it's a restaurant, that person might get you the table. Right? I remember this. I remember this very clearly. I was in Singapore, and at the time there was still a restaurant by celebrity chef Mario Batali. I forget the name of the restaurant, but Patso, I think, was the name of the restaurant. I think, um, but Mozza was the name of the restaurant. There you go, and it was popular because it was, celebrity chef and pizza, and he's on TV, and so it's very difficult to get a table. And the thing is, Mario hired a lot of Filipinos for the kitchen and wait staff. The head chef of the restaurant is Filipino. She's Filipina. And so my wife and I go, we line up, right, to get a table. And of course, my wife and I are conversing in Filipino, right? And I think the head waiter hears it and goes, approaches me and goes, Filipino kayo? Oh, table for ilan? For two. Teka lang. The next thing I know, like, may table ako. So the next thing you know, we have a table, we cut the line. Right? And we're like, oh, okay. So we're just kind of, okay, there's a table. Oh, sige. So we're like brought to the table and people are staring at us like, paano sila nakapasok? And we're like, cool. Right? So we get the table. Oh, there, like Bea saying at the airport, our family got free baggage allowance because the person at the counter was a Filipino. Yes. Right. I remember another incident in New York where we were staying at the hotel. The person at the front desk was Filipino, and she tells us where to go. You go here, you go here, you go here, you go here. These are the best food, and they're not expensive. Yeah, go here, go here, go here, go here. Okay, thanks. Right, and it's interesting. It's always a probing thing that happens, right? So you don't instantly go, "Hey, Filipino!" No, no, no. It's very quiet, right? They'll usually kind of go up to you and say something in Filipino, like, Filipino ka ba? And if you respond by, oh, then, oh, sige, teka lang. May ganun. And then, something happens. So that's happened to me in Muji in Singapore as well, where walang size yung, yeah, it's like a secret society. Walang size yung shirt na hinahanap ko. He says, wait lang. Goes to the back, right? Dapat wala nang size, biglang may size. So I call it the Filipino mafia. And apparently, like my cousin who lived in Singapore for a while, is saying that's true. They do look out for each other. So to the point where he was working in Singapore. If he wanted, he didn't work for Apple, for example, but if he wanted an Apple product, one of the Filipinos who worked for Apple has an employee discount. So the guy will buy it for him, and then he pays the guy at the discounted price. And that was just saying that's the mafia, right? That's the Filipino mafia. They do help each other out. So if you are traveling abroad, make sure that you hook up with the fellow Filipinos there. They'll be glad to have you, number one. Number two, you get perks. You are expected to help them too, if you're able. You are expected to share in the help. But merong ganon. And that's kind of that community that this thing is talking about, right? The let's help each other out because we're all in this together kind of thing. The other thing is, of course, ways by which the communities preserve their heritage. And the easiest way for Filipinos to do that in abroad is what? Give a guess.
Eating?
Yes, food.
Yes.
In Hong Kong, right? Our maids got a bad reputation. Why? Every Sunday they will go to a park carrying their calderos of sinigang and adobo, and sinigang and adobo is fine, but what if you're like cooking something like ginagoongan, right? Which isn't the best smelling thing in the world. It's good, but if you're not used to that smell, it's kind of nasty. So they do that. They will sit down in the park. They will open the pots. They will share each other. They will share food. And this happens on Sundays. After Mass, usually they will share food with each other. They'll just get together and share food. And for a while, that was frowned upon by the Chinese because it was just seen as unseemly. Why do you guys have to, go to a park, mess up the park, stink it up with all this stinky food, right? And then probably leave a mess. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a mess left afterwards. And so it wasn't a very, uh, it wasn't liked. But you realize that the reason why these guys were doing that was their way of preserving their heritage. It was their way of trying to stay connected to being a Filipino by sharing the food, right? By eating with each other, by talking to people in the same language, right? And sometimes it's not Filipino, it could be a dialect, it could be, or not a dialect, another language, could be Bisaya, it could be Cebuano, it could be all these other things. But that idea of preserving community is what drives uh, them that what enables them to stay. So okay, going back to this now. There is, of course, the interesting thing about there, and there is a point of debate about this. Na, o sige, nandiyan na tayo sa idea of this diaspora. Some people are saying, but that's not the same as the original idea of diaspora. These guys weren't forced out, right? They can come back, especially now, right? OFWs can come back if they wanted to, right? That's been the theme of the government, is they're trying to get them back, trying to come back. Ironically, one of the candidates of our presidential candidate is saying that he wants to send more people abroad. So it's like one has to one people are trying to get them to come home. Somebody wants to send them out. Anyway, the point being is that it's a debate. It's a point of debate. Now, should we even be considering these guys as diaspora, right? And therefore, aside from this, what constitutes diaspora? How are we diasporic when the scattering is not, the scattering is not unintentional. The scattering is for us voluntary, and it's not permanent. It's not, you're not trapped. You can't. There's not a restriction on returning, right? So those are some of the ideas that we will be looking at as we look at this. So because what we will see is that the experience of diaspora uh, can still happen, even if uh, there is this possibility of returning, even if it is a voluntary choice by the person to leave. There is still a sense of diaspora. And more interestingly, as it said here, they or their ancestors were dispersed. Diaspora can be multi-generational. And so sometimes actually the sense of being alienated isn't even in the people who left, but is found instead in the people who, the children of the people who left, right? And we'll talk more about that in other sessions. But yeah, so the concept of diaspora has to expand, right? It's actually expanded even further than this, and that's another point of debate. They're saying that diaspora can happen inside your own country, right? You can become a scattered seed within the country, within your country of origin. And they're saying some things that do that, is including things like the Japanese hikikomori phenomenon. Are you familiar with that? The Japanese hikikomori is the shut-ins, people who will not leave their house at all for anything. So they don't have a job, they don't socialize except online. They will avoid contact with other people. And they will have all their food delivered, right? Usually somebody ends up taking care of them, like bringing them food and stuff because they will not go out. And that's that's one of the arguments being made for another form of diaspora. Oh, neat? What's a neat?
Not educated, employed, or in training.
Yes.
That's like what they're called
Yeah, yeah,
also.
yeah. Right. These people who will play video games all day and really not give a shit about anything else. Right. And that's that yeah, I call it the neat or the hikikomori. That's not just a phenomenon in Japan. It does happen elsewhere. Right. And there's saying that's a form of diaspora too. But it's a the removal is not, you know, the removal is caused by social media. The removal is caused by technology rather than, or psychological issues rather than an external push to get them out. This one, they kind of withdraw, right? They kind of withdraw and hide. So are they considered diaspora? There are arguments about that. There are people who will feel alienated because of social media, right? If you feel left out, if you feel excluded because of your social media, are you therefore diasporic as well? Right? So there are questions like that that are happening right now, right? And now I will kind of stop and leave the floor to you guys. What do you think? What do you think about everything we've talked about so far? Maybe think about what you've read. You were given a ton of definitions in that list, in that article, right? There is a reason why there are a ton of definitions. What do you think? Any of them stick out to you?
Sure.
Mm. Go, Graph.
Okay. Because like I was thinking about what you're talking about. They have like a feature of diaspora is that they don't feel connected to wherever they are.
Mhm.
And like I think that's a pretty big example of what that pretty big feature of what makes a diaspora. Because I have a uncle who lives in the States, but my dad jokes that when he looks in the mirror, he's blonde and blue-eyed, but he's like in chick and in real life. So he doesn't feel like he's Filipino anymore. So I'm not sure if he qualifies as diaspora, because to be a
Yeah.
diaspora, you want to return to your homeland, you want to feel connected to it. Well, he's like very, very
So
American.
he's American. Is he
Yes.
Republican?
Yes.
Yes. Normally, the ones who embrace it become Republican. I hope, is he Trump? Is he a Trump guy?
To our shame.
Ah, yeah.
Um,
Unfortunately, that's that, and that's not unusual in truth. The there are huge. There's actually a huge proportion of of minorities, particularly Latino and Filipino, who are Republican, right? And I really don't understand that. My
but they're
relatives are
not
Republican.
diaspora anymore. If one of the features is that they feel alienated, right?
Yep. So like that's a good question because I do have an uncle who's in the States, and he has pretty much, you know, integrated into American life. He's very, very American. But he wants to come home, right? It's his kids who are very American, who are, I don't think I'll ever see them in the Philippines again, except if they go on like Boracay vacation or something. But his kids are very American. None of his kids have married a fellow Filipino. All of his kids, well, one pala, no, one married a Filipino. But nearly all of his kids married a white person, right? And they feel like Americans. They act American. So some of my nieces and nephews are 6 foot tall, blue eyed. You know, they look white, pretty, but yung bang Pinoy yan, hindi. So there are, and that's the kind of the other question. You can't lump all Filipinos there for a diasporic, right? There is an element of that.
I agree. One last, because I have a tito who sent his children abroad, like to
Mhm.
study, and then they're old now, but one of them has not really come back, and then another one, the youngest, he got married to a white girl,
Mhm.
and then but the middle child, she was in New York. She met a Filipino there, and then she's come home during the pandemic. So now they're here. So
And
of
are they
those,
staying?
yeah, they're staying. They're living here now.
Oh, how interesting.
So it's like of those three, the only one who really qualified as a diaspora was the middle child.
Yeah, yeah. And isn't that interesting? And that's kind of what complicates it. Diba? Inside all families, the diasporic experience is also individual. So, Avi next. Sorry. Go, Abby.
I think I have like two major thoughts slash questions about the idea of diaspora. My first thought is that because diba sabi niyo na these Filipinos can return and they aren't really forced to go abroad. But I remember kasi watching a documentary and like alam mo yung sa mga pelikula, yung mga OFW films, sinasabi kasi they're saying kasi that um they they go abroad because they feel obliged to go there, because if they're gonna stay here in the Philippines, the possibility of starving is like, higher.
Yeah.
So my main question with that is, can that be considered quote unquote like a forced displacement or a traumatic event for them? Because they feel like obliged to go there because yun lang yung that's the place where they can find opportunities
Yeah.
of place to work.
Yeah.
So that's my main question.
Um, to a degree, no, but the degree is very different. I mean, if you compare, for example, you being uh, you being literally kicked out of your country, right, because of your race or your religion or whatever, that's very different from you feeling like you have no choice but to go. Gets there is a choice and there is agency with them. You don't just you don't kind of just get swept into a plane and you go abroad. Normally, what happens is you have to apply, you have to pay, right, to get these things. You sometimes they get deeper in debt, right, because they have to borrow money to be able to pay the fees to process the papers and that stuff. But there is agency there, right? So that's one. But the feeling of being obliged, I'm sure there is, right? There is that feeling of I don't have a choice anymore. Desperation, the desperation of I have no other way. I remember some people I worked with before, their dream, and this was a young lady, her dream was to go to Japan or Brunei, right? And become an entertainer of some sort, right? And her thinking was that's how I make it, right? I can't make it here. I'll make it there. And but there is still agency there. That's kind of, and remember, we're only talking about degrees of this, right? The original diaspora was the one that was forced. Now we're talking about that's definitely still diasporic because now we're talking about, opting to go abroad because of economic need. That's still very valid, naman, right?
And as a follow up, I was thinking about like what you call that. Kasi diba, we have like this text about undocumented
Yeah.
diasporic children, and I was thinking maybe that's also like part of it, but I think that's like another day na. And then my second like thought was what you mentioned about in country diaspora, because I think that's really prominent for countries with a diverse ethno groups. Like for example, in the Philippines, may mga Bisaya, may
Mm-hmm.
mga taga Mindanao, and
for example, they go to Manila.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's also kind of diasporic in a sense. Yun lang po.
Yeah, so Raf is saying on chat now, one of the divisions uses words like migration under pressure. Yeah, so you're pressured to move. Economic pressure can do that, right? The other thing is ano to? Yeah, that's the problem with the Philippines in particular of because of our linguistic diversity, right? We don't really look different. I mean, a person from Cebu looks the same as a person from Manila, but it's what comes out of their mouth that identifies them as, let's say, Cebuano or from Visayas or from Ilocano or from Ilocos, right? And unfortunately, Imperial Manila likes to poke fun at these people, right? I remember when I was in college, one of my classmates in math was Cebuano, and he called everybody bye, right? Bye, bye, right? And he was made fun of because of that. And so how do you feel nga naman? Do you feel less at home, right? And you didn't even leave your country. You just moved to another city, right? The thing there, kasi nga, there are linguistic differences, and that and plus, our historical hostility towards each other because of region, right? The Kapampangans don't like the the Bisaya don't like the, di ba? And so on and so forth. Thank you, Spain, for fostering this kind of hostility towards each other. You know that, right? Because they were using people of different linguistic origins to fight other people when they rebel. So if the Ilonggos rebel, they'll send Kapampangans down. Why? They can't understand each other, so they'll fight. So what happens? Now there's a hostility towards them. There's a mistrust. The Ilonggos don't trust the Kapampangans because in their heads, ano yan, makabebe, traidor, right? And so on and so forth. No? That's kind of the reason, one of the reasons why. So I do feel bad about that. We shouldn't have that at all, right? If anything, we should be studying each other's languages. To me, it'd be cool if I knew Ilocano and Kapampangan and Cebuano and Ilonggo or Bisaya and all these things, right? I'd love to learn them. Maybe someday I will. Oh wait, Bea, go.
Hi. Sir, I wanted to bring up the curious case of the third culture kids to this discussion. Because one of the definitions of diaspora was that it was a spatial and temporal distance. So meaning that one counts as diasporic if there's a sort of distance to be measured from a place of origin.
Yep.
But then TCKs don't have that place of origin. I'm not a TCK, but just according to my like TCK friends, their experience of growing up has always been moving around. So they don't settle in one place. And it's not because they were forced out of their countries or their parents' homeland. It's because it's only just circumstantial because of jobs, like the nature of their parents' jobs.
Yep.
A military or like a missionary brat and all of that. So I think like my question is, do their experiences count as diasporic if I don't know. What
If
are
that's
your
how they
thoughts?
grew up.
Yes.
Well,
But they don't sorry, just to
yeah,
add,
go.
they don't have ano to, even though they don't have a place of origin kasi, they still have inclinations towards a specific place or a culture. So, and that changes for them a lot of the time. So, I
So
don't
like
know.
the inclination, let's say these guys were Filipino, the inclination maybe, let's say, Japan. They feel at home in Japan.
Yeah, sir. But there's also the case that they don't actually have Filipino blood, but at some point of their lives, they stayed in the Philippines.
And just kind of
Developmental years.
decided, oy, okay dito. Or did it influence them in some way?
Right.
And they became quote unquote Filipino. I think like an example of this, one of my cousins is an expat, and he was one of the first, Filipino expatriates. And so he literally lived around the world, and his children grew up around the world because he'd spend, let's say, 5 years in Japan, 5 years in Europe, in different countries, 5 years in the United States. He never stayed in the Philippines, ironically, right? We'd see him when he'd visit. But the thing was, he has two kids, and both of them, therefore, grew up, alam mo yung not really rooted anywhere. So, they spent part of their grade school in one country, they'll spend another part of their grade school in another country, they'll spend part of their high school, in ganon. So their experience of their growing up, their formative experience was you could say fragmented, right? And therefore culturally, well, diverse, but also, if you wanted to anchor yourself somewhere, how do you, right? How do you anchor yourself? And it's very interesting. If I remember right, both kids both kids ended up moving out of the Philippines. Of course, the parents are now retired and they're here, right? They're here. They're retired. They're happily traveling, having fun, taking pictures of food. At least based on what I see on my social media, they keep taking pictures of food. But the kids, interestingly enough, there are two kids. One goes to New York. The other goes to Japan, right? And that's their choice. And I think that the guy from New York says because that's where he feels most at home. The girl who went to Japan says that's where she feels most at home. So, right, the idea of where do you find home if home was never really set becomes subjective. And yeah, so right now, my one cousin is a finance guy in New York. The other one is a teacher in Japan, right? And it was interesting, and their experience growing up was very interesting because they never stayed in any single place. And this wasn't unlike, let's say, OFWs who have this obligate or this desperation to get out. No, he was an expat, right? He was very well paid for everything. So when they went abroad, they didn't actually have a hard time. They were always financially comfortable. The kids got the best education that they could get, right? And so the question of where was home is interesting. So not neither kid decided that the Philippines was home. I know that they tried. They came home with the parents. They tried. They said no. So yeah, they all flew to different countries. Clarice, go.
Hi, sir. Good morning. A thought just came up. It about I recall probably a few years ago there was that whole conversation of the Philippine X. How
The
uh
Philippines.
yeah,
Philippines.
yeah, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
how
yeah.
to pronounce it, yeah. And it was interesting to me na parang this most likely came from a Filipino diaspora abroad.
Yeah.
And it's just that their influences come from various places na. They get influences from the Latina community and the American community. And then they eventually form a different Filipino identity that Filipinos in the homeland don't necessarily understand or grasp because we're not exposed to those influences the way that they are. And it's just interesting that they have this desire to reconnect back to the Philippines, back to their homeland. But it's that um, homeland itself that sort of rejects that identity that they formed. Because it was such a there was such a I guess violent reaction when that term came up. And
I
yeah,
remember.
it was just interesting to me na their way of connecting was rejected by the very place that they wanted to connect to. So,
Yep. Before I answer that, Sergey, go.
To add to that lang, I got very heated in this part of the conversation before, but um, I get like a lot of like explanations. Because it is uniquely Filipino American and not even like other
No.
Filipinos elsewhere in the world. It's
Yep.
specifically Filipino American that tried to spark this movement, and it came about as a direct response to the Latinx movement.
Yep.
In that there were a lot of arguments about how the Latin languages are specifically gendered, whereas the Filipino languages aren't, and a lot of um I almost said homegrown. I felt ew. Um, a lot of uh natural born Filipinos were very aggravated by the concept because it's like they were trying to ascribe an identity onto the Filipino that specifically wasn't ours.
Yeah.
And it's like they were trying to adapt the experiences of other diasporic peoples, which was
Mhm.
which is pretty interesting.
It is, and the problem really, and I got the reaction from people here, right? And imagine I talk to Filipino teachers, right, and people who write in Filipino, and they were like, and to them it was like, ang tanga-tanga naman nila, right? But the thing is, uh, you have to understand that these guys probably aren't very good at Filipino to begin with, and so they're trying to look for an identity that they can claim as their own, right? And the big problem with that really is, for those of you who've taken foreign languages, right, whether French or Spanish, right, there are genders to the language. There are genders to the word, right? I'm still studying French now, and I hate it. Why? Because the gender keeps driving me nuts, right? This word is female, therefore you use this, you know, this article and this way of spelling and all of this, but they mean the same thing. Why can't I use just one? Which is what Filipino is. Filipino has no gender in the language, except Filipino, Filipina, but that's because you're designating particular genders. But let's say baso is baso. In Spanish, it's el baso, right? You cannot say la baso, right? And that's kind of the problem that we have. Yes, the gendered part of Filipino is the part we derive gendered. Yes. So in other words, Filipino inherently is not a gendered language. And so the mamser. You're right, right? The mamser. Hello, mamser. It's funny. One of my friends who's homosexual goes into a Jollibee, and he doesn't look homosexual. He's very, very put together corporate guy. Walks in, and the janitor goes, "Good morning, ma'am, sir." And he's like, "How did you know?" So anyway, that's kind of, I think, what triggered people here. The people who are very familiar and use the language. It's like, anong pinagsasasabi mo, right? Because to us, why are you non-gendering a non-gendered language? Why are you non-gendering an inherently non-gendered identity? Filipino, Filipina is not exclusive of, alam mo yun, we're not excluding one from the other. It's really just designating Filipino, Filipina. And so there is a difference from the idea of Latino, Latina, because I think Latino, Latina means something very different. When you are Latino, there are definite meanings to it. There are Latina, there are definite meanings to it. That's why Latinx. Also, the idea of including kasi people who are like members of the LGBTQ community. But like in the Philippines, it's generally accepted that when you say Filipino, it is not a gender term. It is a citizenship kind of thing, right? There is no gender to it. But anyway, right? So and so a lot of my friends who are in Ateneo and the writing community were like, ano ba? What's going on? And but it was also not fair to kind of stomp on these people naman the way people did. Now, you know what? If they're not as good with Filipino as you are, because you grew up using it, and these guys are probably studying it, or at best use it conversationally at home, they're not going to understand the particular idiosyncrasies of the language. So to stomp on them also, it's not fair. Parang they're trying to find home nga and then home kind of says you're an idiot. Diba? It's wrong. So I do feel for them, and I don't think that was the right thing to do. I think it would have been it would have been better if there was a gentler discussion. But because it's social media, people get triggered and explode. But you see there the search for identity, right? The reason why the Filipino community in the United States did that was they're looking for identity. They want to be identified as distinctly Filipino. And I think now, no, with things like Philippine food becoming more prominent in the States, that it's it's becoming more urgent. Ano nga ba ibig sabihin ng pagiging Pilipino? And that's something that we look at because a lot of the work we're going to be looking at will be different people talking about. Oh, somebody saying that she read about the food cart in New York City selling tusok food. That would like sell like hotcakes. You think about that, right? Deep fried hard boiled eggs. Diba? How can you lose? Diba? Shish balls and stuff like that. I don't know if they'll go for things like isaw though. I mean, like the intestines and stuff would probably like be ew, especially when they hear what we call them, right? But anyway, so katip marketing right there. Tusok food. Okay, anyway, so diba, there's a search for identity that happens, and we'll talk about. I'll probably say this more than once over the course of the semester, but the experience of some people, some Filipinos abroad, especially second generation Filipinos, the ones who may have been born abroad and grew up abroad. Some of them, despite growing up abroad, right, despite being American, uh, will still get asked, "Where are you from?" And isn't that insulting? You probably have a perfect American accent, educated in an American school, American job, wearing American clothes, driving an American car. And yet, at a certain point, somebody who's probably white will say, "Where are you from?" That's insulting, right? Yes, Bea.
Sir, very quickly lang.
Yeah, yeah.
But if they're insulted by that, then that means there's a part of, doesn't that suggest that they have a sort of shame in being identified with another race? Or like particularly a brown race,
Yeah,
diba?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing is, and this is something that was I was able to talk to a psychiatrist who lives in the States, and he's Filipino, and his clientele is mostly second generation Filipinos. In other words, Filipinos whose parents immigrated and they were born and grew up there. And there is a disconnect, right? Oh wait, well, let's get that later. But Rafi, real quick, because it's like 9:22, we're about running out of time.
Real quick, the cousin that I mentioned before who came back with her husband's actually second generation. But one of the
Filipino.
reasons he came back now is because it was very racist in the States. So when they'd see him, they'd think, "Are you Mexican?"
Yeah,
Or they'd come out and just slur him like when he was
yeah.
walking in the street. And this was in New York, one of the more diverse areas in the States. So there's really a feeling of not belonging, even if you've been born there, you grew up there.
Yeah, yeah, that was what I was about to say. You know, this psychiatrist whose clients were all second generation Filipinos had that experience. Na you were taught by your parents that you are no longer Filipino, you are American. That's why we're here, right? Separate yourself from, and that's a term used. No, no more. You're no longer Filipino. That's it. You're done. And then when you go to the grocery, some white dude says, "Where are you from?" You're not American. Or worse, you see the sabi nila, they're speaking in perfect English and they get corrected for grammar. When they know that they're not saying anything wrong, somebody will correct their grammar. And they were saying, "Why are you correct? I grew up here." Right? And that's kind of this drives this question of, if I don't belong here, where do I belong? Right? And that's kind of where that search for identity comes from. I'm not welcome here, but I wasn't taught anything else. And so a lot of them are searching for their Filipino identity. And unfortunately, a lot of times they don't get help from their parents. Because the parents are like, "We're no longer Filipino, we're American. Why are you doing this?" right? I'll tell you more stories in next session. But because it's time to end the session, right? We'll talk more about this. And we'll talk about the literary works that were in the module. Right? We'll discuss them also in the next session. So I hope this was a good one. I enjoyed it. Right? Thanks for coming. I hope it was a good discussion. I'm stopping recording now.